Well, thanks very much for that introduction. I think agreeing on the title is a little bit of understatement. There was a point at which my lack of response was taken as assent by Chris, and in fact, it is a perfect title, short but succinct, and I'm going to talk about why the subtleties of those three words in a minute. Chris asked me to talk for about 45 minutes. I might usually go on a little bit longer, but I'll leave a good amount of time for questions as we go through, at the end, sorry. And, as Chris said, I'm an economist, so I am going to have an economist's take on a lot of the issues that might be rather, I don't know, controversial, maybe not, maybe just slightly eyebrow-raising when viewed from other perspectives. In fact, I think, Chris has sort of prefaced many of the issues that I'm going to talk about in his introduction, but I'm not sure I would have exactly the same spin on why we got to where we are as he put out in terms of the role of governments and how we got here. Anyway, so let's just get on with it, and we'll see how we go. The first thing I should say, we always start by saying this. Of course, we all know that population is aging, and we mustn't forget that it's such a remarkable success story, if you like, for human development. But of course, it raises particular challenges and opportunities for government. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is for families as well, because if you remember that a lot of things that governments do, families could do, and vice versa, and that's going to become an issue, a sort of theme a little bit in some of the things that I talk about towards the end. So the aging of the population is raising issues for families, family structures, networks, governments, policy regulators, and everything else. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about this particular issue in where there are opportunities and challenges, and that's extending working lives. And in fact, I'm going to talk about two aspects. One, I'm talking about the fact, actually, working lives are already extending. I'm going to give you some data on that. We're already in Britain, more so than many other countries in Europe, we're already at a point where we're moving along that line. So I'm going to talk a bit about why working lives have already been extending here in Britain. But then I'm going to talk about, looking forward, given what we know about what happened now in the last 20 years, and in fact in the last 40 years, what does that suggest we might see on the horizon for future extension of working lives? And what me as an economist would think of might be the kind of driving and limiting factors behind those kind of changes. So that's kind of broadly speaking the way that I'm going to break it up. I should say that, to the extent that I'm doing anything formal, I'm going to be thinking about the causes of these extensions of working lives. I'm not going to really say anything about the consequences. Of course, that's a huge debate, whether work is good for your health, bad for your health, the degree to which staying, mentally and physically active can lead to healthier retirement is a huge issue, and one that there's a lot of research on. I'm not going to say anything about it today. But other than the fact right now, which is what I would say, is that if you want to understand that second issue, the consequences of longer working lives, you cannot do it without first understanding what's driving those longer working lives. You would get your associations totally wrong if you just looked at the consequences of longer working lives without wondering about why those working lives happened in the first place. So I'm going to talk mainly about the key drivers and limiting factors on working life. I'm going to show you that we need to look at both long-term and more recent trends to understand this. And also, I think you need to dig deep in the sort of new language of big data. You need to think there are very different things going on for different groups of the population. And to do this, so I'm going to really I'm going to draw on various different pieces of work that I've been doing with co-authors from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, various different co-authors in different combinations over the last few years. And it sort of really uses a lot of the official labour market surveys that cover a really long period of time. They allow us to go back with individual level data back to the late 1960s and look at who's working. But they're not very good they don't tell us very much about these people other than whether they're working, maybe age, obviously, education, various different things. They don't tell us some of the things we'd like to know about health and various different measures of disability. So for that, we have to turn to the study that Chris referred to that I started along with James Nasru, who's here, and various colleagues at the time at UCL, where we are following a large cohort of older adults and measuring everything about their lives, their health, their cognitive function, their disability, the kind of jobs they're working in. And we're following them over the same people over this 10-year period, and that allows us, in some of my analysis here, to get much deeper into some of the more recent trends. I should say that this is a sort of large program of work. It's been funded heavily by the Economic Social Research Council through our research centre at IFS, and also through various other grants from National Institute on Aging in the US and the Sloan Foundation when I come to talk about some of my more comparative analysis. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to just give a very brief motivation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we all know, life expectancy, and I'm going to talk about the raw trends in employment at older ages. I'm going to talk briefly about understanding recent trends. I'm going to talk about the differences between men versus women. I'm going to talk about the role of pensions and pension incentives and disability benefits. And then I'm going to try and think more speculatively, what might we be able to say about how much room for future extension of working lives do we have? And depending on your point of view, this could be a hugely optimistic or hugely pessimistic conclusion. You know, you could be a, oh, we're all going to have to work till we drop type person. Or you could more be a, oh, look, isn't it fantastic? We're all going to be able to be active and participating and have all these choice and avail to work. But certainly, I'm going to argue, I think, that there's quite a lot of scope for quite a lot longer working lives in the future. And it might be the case that that's where we'll end up. Okay. This is a picture that I always like to start with, which is life expectancy if you reach 65, how many extra years are you expected to live? And this is, we can get incredible data on this in England and Wales. We can go back to 1841. And what you can see here is well, obviously, life expectancy is increasing. If you think about the aging of the population, it arises from three different factors. It arises from changing fertility rates, the fact that generations are having fewer children. It arises from reductions in infant mortality, and it arises from reductions in essentially old age mortality. Now, if you're thinking about retirees, the last one of those is the only important one. So we have to think about, you know, if you're thinking about what a worker is going to be like at the point where retiring, the only thing that's relevant is their life expectancy at age 65 or 55 or whatever. And this picks out just exactly that element. So it's, and of course, a lot of aging of the population is driven by other factors. So the population was aging much earlier in the 20th century because we were reducing fertility rates and we were reducing infant mortality. But it was only much later, and I mean much, much later, when we had this huge and very, very rapid increase in life expectancy, particularly for men reaching 65. And this, the speed of this is just, you know, really quite astounding. So if you look at, for example, the last 20 years between 91 and 2011, in that 20-year period, the number of years that a 65-year-old could expect to live has risen from something like 13 to something like 18. That's 5 extra years in a 20-year period. That's a hugely rapid change for the men. Of course, the women started, as we know, increasing at a much earlier point in the 20th century. And that's going to be relevant for some of the things I say. But the point I want to make here is just how fast, if you're looking at retirees around this second half of the 20th century, it really is a really rapidly changing game. In the way that for the previous 120 years, things have basically stayed the same. Men reaching 65 were going to live for 10 or maybe 11 years, for pretty much 120 years. Okay, so that's the recent history is very important. Now that's the only thing I'm going to really say on the demographics. On the employment, this is just the stylized fact. So this is the sort of thing that you might see now if you look. Chris already sort of slightly stole the punchline, I think, of this particular picture. But if you know, the success story, if you like, is that the increase in employment, this is the fraction of people, for the purpose of today, I'm going to call older workers 55 to 74. So just take all people 55 to 74. I've got millions of them in these surveys, literally something like 12 million observations. I look at them over time and I say, what fraction of them are working? So the red line is the UK average, and the blue line is the Northwest region only. Okay, and you can see that for both the UK and in the Northwest, we've had this steady increase, and quite substantial in terms of its quantity in the proportion of people working at these older ages. And that, that's what you'll see, and you'll see that in many regions. And you'll see that not to such a large extent in terms of quantity in other countries around the world. We've certainly, along with the US and maybe Japan, are at the sort of frontier, if you like, of this kind of change. So that all looks like very good news. People are getting healthier, people are working for longer. But the rest of this graph, which isn't on here, is the rather surprising bit, which is that prior to this 1995, we'd been through this period of hugely declining employment. So we're now at the state where, even having had 20 years of sustained growth, older workers, and by which I mean 55 to 74, are still not even as likely to be working as they were in the 1970s. And that's particularly the case for the Northwest, where, as we all know, the region was hit sort of differentially in the 1980s. So you have a period of deviation where we have, in the early years of labour force survey, we don't have so many observations, so things are a bit noisy when you get one region at a time. But we have a period of deviation in the 1980s, and then we have parallel tracking where we never caught back up, but we've then had the same kind of trends. Now, when I started thinking about this lecture, I had grand ideas to do every single statistic for the Northwest as well as for England as well. But to be honest, it's really boring because it's pretty much the same. I looked at various different stories. It would be different if you looked at Greater Manchester or the city only, but then you don't have a lot of data. But when you consider the region, all of the trends, whatever I talk about, I checked it all. Whatever's going on in the UK or in England and Wales is going on in the Northwest as well. There's really no substantial differences. It is possible to look. So this is pretty much the last thing I'm going to do on the Northwest specifically. But this is just to say that particularly in the Northwest, employment rates are still not as, so what are they, 35% instead of 40% in the 1970s. And this is just everybody between age 55 and 74, men and women together. So the first thing to say about this is that trend itself masks considerable important variation, and particularly between men and women, and particularly between age groups. This slide summarizes the findings, but I'll just talk you through it briefly. So this is another, I'm saying there's going to be loads of pictures, by the way, in this, so you can sort of just watch them drift by. So this is now splits that same set of people, 55 to 74-year-olds, into men and women. And within men and women, I look at each of the 4 5-year age categories. So the first thing that you can see is for women, we've got a very different story than the men. Pretty much every year, there's more women working than the previous year. It's true for the younger women, 55, 59, 60 to 64. It's true, actually, if you look hard at the 65 to 69s. And in the 1970 to 74, they were actually pretty similar with a slight increase. So what we've seen for women, of course, is successive cohorts of women, essentially who've been in the labour market for longer than the previous generation, coming through, driving increasing participation. Certainly a success story, one that I want to come back to at some point later in the lecture. The story for men is really rather different. Particularly for men between 55 to 59 and 60 to 64, we had this huge exit from the labour market in the 1970s and 80s to a point which hasn't been anything like compensated for by now. So you've gone from, if you're looking at 60 to 64-year-old men, you're less than 60% of them are currently working compared to, and in the 70s it was 80% working. So despite the fact that they've been going up since the 1990s, they've gone nowhere near to reclaiming their levels of the 1970s. And in fact, this is, I kind of like the yellow line here. Despite the fact that employment of 70 to 74-year-olds has been going up steadily since the mid-90s, there were still more 70 to 74-year-olds working in the early 1970s than there are now. Okay? So that's, what I want to talk about is why have we seen this U-shape, particularly for men? What do we think about the driving factors of that? And then having known about that, what does that suggest that we might be able to do if we wanted to going forward. Okay, so I'm going to start with the sort of economists' explanations of these recent trends. And the first one I'm going to talk about is what we might call the incentives to work. Okay, and in particular, the incentives to work can be sort of concentrated, the debate certainly has been focused around what's inherent in pensions and in disability benefits or welfare benefits more generally. And in principle, both types of programs can be thought of as placing a tax on work. Okay, if there's a certain age at which you reach, beyond which, if you make a pension contribution, it's not going to add any more value to the pension that you'll ultimately receive, you're making a contribution that's worth nothing. That's like a tax. That's almost just like saying someone's taking a bit of your wage away and they're going to give you nothing in return. That's a tax on work. That is a characteristic that a lot of pension systems have had in the past. And that places, at the margin, it says, well, if Chris is 66 and I'm 64, the employer is going to pay us both the same wage, but that wage means less to him because he's got to pay this pension than it does for me. And so he's less likely to work than I am because he's getting less of a wage offer for the same job, essentially. Okay, and the same thing would be happening with disability benefits, for example, the way in which that if you don't work, you get your income replaced, can be thought of as a tax on work or a subsidy on leisure. So I want to talk about how that might play. So here's the first. So the first thing I want to say is, over the last 15 years or so, I've been doing quite a bit of work, as have other economists, and just in case you're skeptical about, you're probably, economics is nonsense, it can't explain the financial crisis, all that. That was macroeconomics. Okay, this stuff works. Okay, incentives matter. If I offer to pay you, one person more than the other, typically at the micro level, the person who's going to get paid more does more. Okay, and this is a simple graph. It looks simple. I spent about 4 years calculating that dot there. And other people in other countries spent their own 4 years calculating other dots. And what this does is this is a graph that looks at what we call the tax force. The tax force is the implied rate of taxation on work that is inherent in the pension system. Right? So in the government pension systems, it varies. There's some systems like France, Belgium, Italy, and Netherlands. Implicitly, they place huge taxes on work of the older people. And there are some systems like the US and Sweden that implicitly place very low taxes on work. And there are some in the middle. We had to go through lots of sort of boring calculations to figure out what those implied taxes on work do. But once you've got that, you can correlate that with what we call here the unused capacity. This is basically the fraction of older workers who are not working. Okay, so this says, and this, you can see the results for yourself. In the countries where the tax on work is high, people aren't working. In these highest cluster of countries, you've got sort of 65% of older workers not working in the countries where implicitly the pension system is taxing their work. Okay? So that was a very strong correlation. For those of you who like that sort of thing, it's R squared of, so we can explain 86% of the cross-country variation with the variation in taxes. You may say, well, isn't that just permanent differences across countries? I won't go into this in any detail, but you can actually use changes to reforms. So when a country makes a change, the tax changes. And you can use that to forecast what would the work change be, and then you can measure that. And this just shows you, and that using that estimation, we can simulate, if you like, what would be the effect of changing the tax on work. A 3-year delay is like saying, we're going to actually say, well, we're going to delay your social security or your pension benefits by 3 years. What's the effect of that going to be on your work? Or specifically in this chart, on your being out of work? And in all the countries, when you do that exercise and you simulate less out of work, i.e. more work, when you delay the time at which people are going to release their social security benefits. So that's just to say that these incentives in pension systems matter. Okay? It's fact one. In fact, two, and this is really just for those economists who specialize in wanting to know what reforms happened when. But this is basically just, in Britain, the main point of this is to say, these incentives, these taxes on work, they affect work. And in Britain, we've been removing them. If you look at a lot of these dates, 1990, 1995, 1989, 2010, over the course of the last 20 years, we've been taking away all these implicit taxes on work, steadily. Through various different ways, through the way in which we might be moving from defined benefit to defined contribution, from the way in which we allow now, for example, anyone here is claiming a state pension will know that you can go to work and they're not going to take your state pension away. 20 years ago, if you earned an extra £1, you would lose £1 of state pension income. Why is anyone going to work? Okay? Now that's no longer the case. So all these factors have been gradually taken away. We know these factors are stopping work, and so therefore, without wanting to get too complicated and quantify it, that has been a factor in why we are seeing more work. And at the same time as taking away these incentives, the other thing that we all know about pensions in Britain is that they're worth less than they were. Okay, the public pension. So at the same time, we're actually making them less generous. So we're not just making the incentives less, but we're making the thing that those incentives relate to a smaller number. So we're making it less of a feature in people's lives. This is just a simple chart that we always produce from the IFS, but I think it's quite a nice one. Along here we have the date of birth of a cohort. So these are people born in the 1920s, 1950s. These are the people currently retiring in the solid bars. And then the sort of grayer bars are the people who are going to retire in the future. And what we've done, because we know the rule, we've programmed, what I had to do to get that dot, by the way, I'd have to program every single pension system in every single year since 1948. And you can simulate what anybody would get. So if you take a man who works in the middle of the income distribution for the whole of their life, this is how much they'd get out of the state pension. So they would get approximately 15% of their average earnings in the basic state pension. They would get a number that started by being about 10% of their average earnings from the state earnings-related pension. Over time, that grew. That was, over through the 70s and 80s and early 90s, that pension was becoming more generous. And now we've got, as of 2015, the introduction of the single-tier pension. What that means, this is now a flat number, that's because it's going to be the same for everybody, it's going to be flat at around 20% of earnings for everybody. This is the little transitional period for people who've got some past contributions, and by the time we get to 1975 cohort, so sort of my sister's generation, so then there will be purely the single-tier pension at 20% of average earnings. So we've gone through a period where pensions got more generous, and then we're going through a period where they're getting less generous. Okay. So that's the first thing. The second part of the incentives picture is disability benefits. Again, I'm going to go quite quickly over this. I should get my watch out. Because disability benefits have incentives to work too as well. If you're going to say to somebody, well, you can work if you like, but if you don't work, I'm going to give you £200 a week, versus you can work if you like, but if you don't work, I'm going to give you £50 a week. Now, of course, it's a complicated equation, but you must expect some people to respond to that kind of incentive. And at the same time as we've been dealing with pensions incentives, the government has been introducing reforms that have been typically addressing disability incentives as well. This is what happens just to the numbers of people on disability benefits over the last 30 years. We had this huge rise from 1 million up to 2.5 million claimants over exactly the period where labour market participation rates were falling. Then it plateaued. It's worth saying that actually, if you look hard at this, the number of people in the over 50s claiming benefits actually went down. But this is in millions of people. And in fact, the same thing happens if you look at the number of employees. You've got to be very careful looking over periods of time with millions of people, because the size of each generation is changing. Remember, we've got an aging population. There are many more older people now than there were even 30 years ago. So 1 million 65 plus is a very different share of that. The probability of being on benefits is very different. If I change this graph into what's the probability that a 65-year-old or 50-year-old gets benefits, you see, there we go. You see a very different story. So this is the line for 64-year-old, same numbers. All I've done is divided by the number of people in the population who are in that age group. Okay? So you've seen, since 1995, when approximately 28% of 60 to 64-year-old men were on disability benefit, that number has plummeted to less than 15%. Similarly, for the 55 to 59s, it used to be over 20%, it's now less than 15%. When you put these disability numbers in terms of rates, what's the probability that somebody of this age is actually on disability? You see huge declines, particularly of men, in the proportion of people on disability. Not so much of women, rather interestingly. And very different, this is the first piece of evidence I was going to show from ELSA, our English longitudinal study of aging. Over the last 10 years, we can look at how these trends are, but not by education, by sex, and by the level of disability. So essentially what I've done in this table, let's focus on the top first. This is the 2002, our first year of our sample. If I look at all people between 50 and the state pension age, and I can sort of measure, if you like, I can measure the level of their disability. We know what kind of conditions the DWP asks, or ATOS as it is now, asks in their tests. And we can measure those conditions and how many people have them. So we can see that, amongst the severely disabled, we've got 50, or more than half of people on disability benefits in 2002. For that number, and actually, to be honest, that hasn't come down by so much. It's just come down from 55 to 37% over a 10-year period. What's come down by much more is, for example, people with mild or moderate disabilities with 15 or 34%. Those rates have come down really quite substantially. There's a number of other things. If you're a data geek, this is a good table because this shows you that actually within that set of people with moderate, for example, disability, there's quite a lot of difference in the probability of being disabled according to whether you're a man or a woman and according to whether you're high or low education. Disability benefits replace a much higher fraction of income of a low education worker. So you would expect them to have a bigger effect on those kind of people. And in fact, you can see, if you look at the change, you can see huge differences. 50% of this group, male, low education, and by low education, I mean anybody who left school basically before their A-levels, so it's not that low. But the probability, even in a 10-year period, the number of people on benefits went from 25 or 50 to 11 or 21 amongst men. So really quite sharp reductions of being in disability benefit. Okay. So it's a complex story, right? Because we've got pension incentives changing, we've got disability benefits changing. Women have got a really rather different experience to men. We know that disability is more likely to be correlated with socioeconomic advantage, income, wealth, so that's going to be hitting the poor. Pensions tend to hit more like the rich. So it's a very complex story as to how these things are changing. One thing that we can do, at least over the last 10 years, is say, well, how do these all fit together when we array people just by the wealth, rich to poor? So what have I done here after explaining this chart? So this is the changes in work over the last 10 years, because we can only do this since 2002. So I take between 2002 and 2012, and I divide people into 5 groups according to how much wealth they have. From the poorest quintile, the poorest fifth of men, through to the richest. Separately for females, here I do all, and this is the unconditional, everybody in our sample. So just over 4 percentage points increase in work. That's exactly what we see in the national statistics. But that 4% increase is very differently distributed across different types. We've got poor men having really rather large increases in the probability that they're working. They're not on disability benefits anymore. They're not on public pensions. Public pensions are less generous, and they're probably working. The incentives are changing. But richer men, really, there's no systematic change. Women, because of the cohort effects, all of the women are working more, but in particular, the poorest women are working a lot more. Okay? So there's a really rather interesting patterning, and what that means is that even over a 10-year period, the light bars here are how this is just the number of people who are working. Actually, I thought this is the number of people who are not working, sorry. This is the number of people who are not working in each of these wealth categories. So in 2002, 3/4 of the poorest men, aged 55 to 74, were not working. That's fallen by 6 percentage points, not much, but it's certainly fallen. It's now sort of less than 70%. There's the big change between sort of something like 65% of these guys falling to 50%. So what we're seeing is, if you look at the light bars, you see essentially a stronger relationship between work and wealth. The poor used to not work, and the rich, to some extent, everybody else was kind of flat. But now, actually, we're seeing, in the dark bars, we're seeing less of a correlation between work and wealth than we used to, because of the way these incentives and pensions and disability benefits have changed. Okay, so that's really my take on what's been happening. Okay, I haven't talked at this point in time about the kind of jobs people are doing and how they're doing them, but I think even that is enough to get us started on what might happen next. So what am I going to do and divide the rest of the time that I've got remaining is I'm going to sort of, I'm going to pick up on what I've just been talking about, pensions and health. And in particular, I'll say, is there anything more that we can say about it? Given that I've just told you that we've abolished all pension disincentives, is there anything more to say about pensions? And I think there's quite a lot more to say about health. And then I'll talk really about these other factors that I think are going to be equally important going forward, and I'm going to group them broadly into labour demand and labour supply. Okay, so the first thing, is there anything else that we can say about pensions? I told you, you can now work and draw a state pension. You can not work and not draw. You can get to 67 if you want, not work, defer your state pension. You could continue working for your employer and draw a defined benefit contribution from them. You could, literally, there is no link between your pension and your employment anymore. There's no incentive. No financial tax on work placed by our pension system. So what else could the government possibly do to help people work more? Well, one thing that we all know is happening is the increase in the state pension ages. Now, this is where I have to sort of say this is the bit that economics cannot explain, right? Because state pension age is changing, and yet I've just told you that that shouldn't change the tax on work at all. If people only responded to the tax on work, then the state pension age ought not to matter. But it turns out it does matter. And so this is the figure for, this is the one slide here that's not based on one of my papers, although it is based on from some of my co-authors' papers. What's going on at the moment is that the state pension age for women is rising, as you know, from 60 to 61 to 62, and it's going to carry on rising up to 65. So what this slide does, this slide looks over the period from 2003 to today, and this is individual years of birth. So I look at 60-year-old women, for example, the blue one. Here they are, and this is the average fraction of them working. And then at some point in time, the line becomes dotted, and that means that those people are going through the window where their pension age is going from 60 to 61. Okay? And then here, the 61-year-olds, then, because we've now done them, and then what happens with the reform is that now in the last couple of years, the 61-year-olds are going from the window where their pension age is going from 61 to 62. And then in 2 years' time, we'll be able to have dots on this line. Now, compare the blue line, which is the 61-year-olds, to the 60-year-olds here. This is exactly the same years, it was the same the same recession that they were all living through. They're doing, on average, they're pretty similar people, 60-year-old women and 61-year-old women. And yet the 61 were flat, and the 60 were going up. And in fact, the 59 were flat as well. So 59-year-old women were pretty flat over those 2-year periods. 61-year-old women were pretty flat, and yet the 60-year-olds were going up. Now let's do the same experiment for the next year. Here we've got the 61-year-olds. Well, the 62 are pretty flat, the 60 are pretty flat, but the 61 are going up. Right? Now that's a graphical exposition of where you can use this reform to estimate. But basically, what you see is like a 7 or 8 percentage point increase in work amongst women as the state pension age rises. Okay? Despite the fact that actually the tax on their work isn't changing at all. So that's an explanation, if you like, that can't be explained by my sort of incentive story. But what it does suggest is that we're going to see future increases in work on the horizon, even without, I've already said we've reduced the generosity of pensions, we've reduced the incentives. You might think work isn't going to increase anymore. But this state pension age reform having an effect over and above that says actually, I think as the state pension age changes, we are going to see more women working. And then, of course, when we get to 2020, the state pension age goes up for the men and the women both, and we'll see them coming through as well. There's some very interesting consequences of this reform, by the way, that I won't talk about now, but I could talk about later if we get to it in questions. The husbands of these women are more likely to work as well, actually. So if you're married to a 60-year-old in this period, you're more likely to stay and work for a bit longer. Spillovers between couples. So that's the first thing. So I'm going to say I think that the state pension age is going to have an effect on work, even though it doesn't have an effect on incentives. That's positive number one. If you're a pro-work person, that's positive number one. If you're a sort of anti-work person, that's negative number one. And here's positive or negative number two, which is, now I'm going to use this word rather controversially. Let's think about the capacity to work, people's capability to do a job in terms of their health, broadly measured. Okay, I want to consider an extreme example where the only thing that determines your ability to work is your health. So let's propose there's nothing else in the world. If I'm healthy enough, I can work. If I'm not, there's no other demands on my time. I don't have any. So what I can now do, if I'm willing to think about this, I can think about, let me look in different periods of time, or let me look at different ages and compare how health and work are related. And if I can measure that, then what I can do is I can predict, using that relationship, how current generations of old people could work if they wanted to, by comparing their health to people in different states of the world. I'll try and explain it in various different ways. Method one is I can look back through past years, based on what I was talking about earlier, the probability of dying. That's a pretty extreme measure of your health. I'll explain it in a minute. Or else I could look at a full set of health measures, and I could look at people of different ages. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to be trying to think about our older 55 to 74 and ask the question, have they got a level of health that enables them to work if they wanted to? How can I answer that? I answer it by looking at other points of time or other points of age where I can see people with a similar level of health actually observed working. If that's the case, then I think, well, the answer to that question should be yes, they can work as well if they want to. So this is what we're going to do. This is the other part of the demography. This chart shows the chance of dying in a 1-year period. It's a rather morbid chart by definition, over time. So obviously, and age. So obviously, as you get older, you're more likely to die within a year. But the blue line is 1970. So in 1970, this is men. The 50-year-old men were less than 1% of them died in a year. And 75-year-old men, 8.5% of them died by the end of the year. That's pretty, over the course of between 1970 and 2015, that 8.5% has come down to 3%. That's the same thing that I was talking about earlier, that very, very rapid increase in late life expectancy. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, suppose I'm going to do the following experiment. Think of a 60-year-old. And they have, I can't quite read it off here, let's say a 65-year-old. They have about, now on the dotted red line in 2015, a 65-year-old has about a 1% chance of dying over the next year. So I could say, well, I can find other people who've got a 1% chance of dying. I could find, I could find a 59-year-old in year 2000. I could even find a 53-year-old in 1970 who had a 1% chance of dying. So instead of comparing 65-year-olds over time, I now want to say, well, I want to compare people who've got a 1% chance of dying, because those are the people who are equally healthy. So I can look, and I'm going to say, well, let me think about the 53-year-olds in 1970. How many of them were working? That, for me, is a number about how many of our current 65-year-olds could be working. Yeah? That's essentially the exercise. And similarly, you can do the same thing for women. First of all, you see, because the increase was much more steady, these lines aren't fanning out by anything so much. So women, for example, 75-year-old women was only 4% likely to die within a year in 1950, and that's fallen to 2% now. So I can take all that data and go back through them and say, how many years of extra work could I get? And this is the most complicated graph of the entire talk. So I'll try and explain it. I could compare, remember I said I could choose any comparison. Here's my 65-year-old. I could compare him to I'll read back along this line, the 1% line. I could compare him to a 63-year-old in 2010, or a 61-year-old in 2005, or a 59. All these different people, they've all got 1% chance of dying. So I could choose one from any year I like. And so this, on the graph here, this tells us how far do I want to go back to pick those people. And then what I can do is I can do that for all my ages, so 55-year-old, 65, 56, 57, 58, and I can add up all the potential years of work that I would get if I went back to that comparison year. Okay, so this says here, let's take, for example, let's say here it's about 1998. If I compared today with 1998, I would have, my estimate is that I would have 2 years extra potential work than I get now in terms of, over the 55 to 74-year-old period. People are working a certain amount of time. I'm predicting by this method that their mortality alone suggests that they could work for 2 years longer. That's just going back to 1997. If I wanted to go back to the 1970s, where I've observed people with very poor health and very high mortality rates working, then I would actually see something like 8 or 9 years potential extra work for today's 55 to 74-year-olds by this method. If I'm really willing to say that in 1970 I saw somebody with a certain health working, if I want to say, well, if I see somebody this year with a certain health, are they working? Could they work? How can I add up that difference? I get 8 extra years potential work. Okay? So that's actually a big amount of spare work capacity if you measure it in this very simplistic way. It's a much smaller number for women because the increase in mortality was less for women. In fact, what happened, a good way of reading this chart is if this line was along the zero axis, then you could say that the work is keeping up with the mortality. So, the increase in work is enough to offset the increase in mortality. That would cause the line to, so you could say for women from 1998 or so, they've been getting healthier, but they've been working, and the work has been keeping them, the work has been keeping up with the improvement in health. But before that, they were getting healthier by more than they were working. And for men, they were getting healthier by a lot more than they were working until probably only the last couple of years when their work's been keeping up with their health. This line at the top, the controversial line that says women could work 10 extra years, this is a reflection on cohorts. Remember I told you about the cohort effects? Women are very different. So you might say, well, in the bottom line, I'm comparing a woman now to a woman in 1970. But the labour market for women is totally different. Now, women are, they're just as likely to work as men. They're doing the same kind of jobs. So maybe I should be comparing a woman now to a man in 1970, because if a man could work with a certain mortality probability in 1970, why can't a woman work with that mortality probability now? So if you really want to say that, you know, gender doesn't matter, which is actually, you know, is a sort of more of a feminist statement than it sounds, actually, this one. If you said that gender really should not matter in the current workplace, then the implication of that, if you just look at the mortality of the women, is that women could be working 10 extra years if you look at what the men used to work with the levels of health that the women now currently have, if you see what I mean. So those are big numbers, potentially 10 years for women, certainly something like 4 or 5 extra years for men, even 2 years for women, even under the less controversial. So there's potentially, if you just look at health, measured by the probability of dying, there's a big amount of work on the table. How, that's basically what I've just said. So how robust is this? Well, I can use this other method, just briefly, that I'll go through, which is, well, instead of doing this, I can do another way of thinking of the same calculation. Let me look at the health today of people who are 50 to 54. These guys are not constrained, they're not in pension, they're not in early retirement, they're probably not yet having to care for, well, they might be doing their grandchildren, but they might not be doing their parents. But for whatever reason, you know, let's think of the 50 to 54-year-olds as a group who can choose whether to work or not, and we can measure their health. I can measure the health in all these different dimensions: diseases, disability, cognitive ability, subjective factors. I've got a huge number of health factors, and I can look at the relationship between that and work. And then what I can do, when I know that relationship, I can take all the people over 55, and I can predict, giving all those factors, could they work, you know, would they work or not if they had the same behavior as the 50 to 54-year-olds? And that's another measure of the capacity to work. And so this is what we get if we do this. More big numbers. Okay, so let me take a 65 to 69-year-old. Let me try and explain this to you. So this says that of 65 to 69-year-olds, 23% of them are working. That's a pretty similar number that we got previously. But if I look at their health, and I'm using that relationship that I've just told you about, I predict, you know, if I was looking at a 50 to 54-year-old with those characteristics, would the 50 to 54-year-old be working? Yes or no? The answer is yes for 56% extra of those people. Right? So this is like 56, one way of saying this is 56% of these 65 to 69-year-olds have a level of health that is equal or better than people who are observed working in their 50 to 54-year-old age group. Okay? So that, again, that's another measure of spare capacity to work. Right? These people have, in particular, 65 to 74-year-olds, there's a really large fraction of them who have health that is better than people who we observe working at younger ages. So how are we going to say that these people, that health is the main factor that's limiting their ability to work? And we can do the same thing for women, and we're going to get the same similar big numbers. Okay? This is you know, for those of you who are into the inequalities in health debate, this is, you know, this is a measure of inequality. We've got, incidentally, we've got here 30% of people in this age group whose health is, if you like, too bad to work. We've got 70% of people whose health is good enough to work. And of that, we've got about 57% of those people who are choosing not to work, and some people who are. So that's that's our differences. So what this is saying is that within each age group, there's huge differences in health. And we've got large amounts of people with very good health at older ages who are not working. Again, good news story. Right? Good health, potential to work if they want to. Okay, this is good. So if you take those two arguments to their conclusion, I'm going to say that pensions and health between them suggest that we actually have the capacity for quite a bit more work at older ages in the future, either on the basis of health or on the basis of essentially the changes that are being driven by pension systems. So what are the other possible limiting factors? And in a true economist fashion, I'm going to go through demand and then supply. Okay, so the demand for older workers. And this is the demand for older workers by firms. Okay, so this is like, will there be jobs for these healthy people who want to work? Now, it's a difficult question. I don't be able to say so much about this. But one thing I'm going to say, certainly in the long run, I'd like to persuade you that in the long run, the answer should be yes. Okay, first of all, we've got more older workers, but we haven't got the same number of younger workers. It's an aging population, it's not a growing population, so we've got fewer younger workers, more older workers. I mean, there's a little bit of growth in the population, of course, and immigration will come into the fact. But what firms are facing is, instead of having 2 younger workers and an older worker, they might have 2 younger workers, 1.5 and 1.5 sort of thing. But they're facing a changing balance in their workforce, not necessarily a reduction, an increase. And second of all, this is a sort of common misconception, if you like, is that somehow older workers crowd out the jobs of younger workers, and therefore firms are facing this choice, one or the other. Governments would prefer having younger workers than older workers. We hear, even in Europe, we hear governments saying, we don't want to encourage older workers to work because there'll be no jobs for the younger people. Right? So that is not true in the long run. Okay? I'll just show you that very quickly. This is actually not about older people, this is about women. If that was true, remember I told you, if you think about female labour market participation, 60, 70% of women working now, whereas it used to be 20%. If the previous story was true, where did all those jobs come from? It wasn't the case that we had a lot of men kicked out of their jobs because the women have got jobs, right? This is a slide from the same International Comparisons Project. This arrays countries by the change in female labour market participation. So some countries have had huge increases in female participation. Some countries have had very small because they were high already. And this is the change in the white in the male participation. There's no relationship. Women can come into the labour market with no effect on men. So why do we think that older workers should be able to come in and go out of the labour market with effects on younger workers? It just doesn't make sense. And in fact, if you remember, this is the same picture. It's curved because it's just a different scale. But if you measure the tax, remember the same thing that I was talking about? How much do taxes on pension systems, how do they vary across countries? And remember, in the highest countries where the tax is right, we see lots of non-participation of older workers. In the lowest countries, we see not very much. So we see a strong relationship, the same relationship we saw between the taxes on retirement and the participation of the older workers. We see zero relationship between the taxes on retirement and the participation of 25 to 54-year-olds. Right? So we did quite a lot of work in this project trying to say, is there any possible evidence that if you have fewer older workers or more older workers in the labour market, you have fewer younger workers? The answer is no. You can look around countries, you can look across time, you just don't see it. So in the long run, we don't need to worry about that story. Of course, in the short run, there's adjustments that need to happen, and we do. This is, I think, one of the big issues, is, are current older workers equipped to do, with the skills to do the jobs that they're going to currently need to do? And I think, as an economist, I'd say, well, you need to separate out the sort of transitory arrangements, like in the next, literally, if we had in the university, if we had a job that needed doing and someone left, we'd need somebody else to do it. That's for sure, that has to happen. But my point is really that the economy, even in quite a short period of time, adjusts. The number of jobs change, the nature of activity changes. And once all that thing's patterned through, we do not see these kind of substitutions that you would imagine. But that doesn't suggest that we don't need to think hard about how long that transition might be. What are the skills that older workers might have? Do they have the right training and skills? Are they vintage specific? Vintage specific is like, do they apply to a certain type of technology? So, I spoke for a while in some work that I was doing for the DWP to BT, and they talked about the fact that in their call centers, they're very good at employing older workers because, older workers are great in call centers. They can operate a phone just as well as a younger worker, in fact, probably better. They don't get angry, they don't get frustrated, and various different things. But on the top of a telegraph pole, this is just a totally different scenario. All the older workers, they're trained with copper, and all the younger workers are using fiber optic. It's a totally different skill set. How long does it take to train an older worker to switch from copper to fiber optic? Is that kind of training cost effective? It's a particular story about the vintage, if you like, which vintage their skills of capital, does it apply to an old vintage of capital or a new vintage of capital? So these things are really important. How long that transition will be, which of our older workers is going to get skilled up in the kind of jobs that are being demanded. That will affect, the short to medium run. It will not affect the long run because the economy will adjust. This is just to say that, you'll be surprised about the amount of training that's going on. Maybe not here because you've come voluntarily to see this lecture, but this is in our study. I just looked briefly for the purposes of a different talk I was doing. What fraction of older people are taking some kind of education or training course? This is amazing. This is like 28% of 50 to 59-year-olds did some kind of education or training course in the last year. And in fact, even 5% of 70-year-olds and something like 15%. And quite a large fraction of those resulted in actually a formal qualification. So there's quite a lot of retraining already going on. But the question is, well, A, you might not think that's a lot, and B, we don't know how effective that is in terms of preserving employment or generating new employment. The final issue on labour demand is that, work is changing. Okay, so people begin to talk about more part-time work. Older workers might want more flexible jobs. They might want multiple jobs, or there might be more use of self-employment, various different types of contracting. So the old sort of era, we know, of full-time jobs can change. And of course, that kind of flexibility is only going to add to my sort of optimistic prediction of more capacity to work. And just to emphasize the role of self-employment, I love this figure. This figure on the right is kind of what I was telling you about right at the beginning. This is the employment rate, number of people in work. This is men. That's the big dip, and recovering not to the level that it was at. And here's women. That's any kind of work. Now I'm going to take the self-employed away. I'm only going to look at employees. Okay? First of all, pretty much the same rate of work for women versus men. Self-employment's become a massive deal because the difference between the blue line in this and this is huge, and it's grown over time. Men who are not were thrown out of the labour market essentially through employees. A lot of them are working to the extent they're coming back through self-employment, not to the same state as women. And in fact, if you get, this is 50, 55, 59. If you go to 50, 54, there are actually more female employees now than there are male employees in their 50s, 54s. Right? I don't know anybody in government that if you told that, they wouldn't be surprised if you told that. Nobody knows that picture as far as I can see. The probability of being an employee, not just any kind of worker, but actually an employee working for a company, if you're 50 to 54, it's higher now for a woman than it was for a man, and it's been higher for about the last 4 or 5 years. And this is the public sector, by the way. The women weren't affected by the recession so much as the men. Okay, so self-employment is changing over time in reaction, I think, to the opportunities that are there in the labour market. So that's the end of the labour demand side. And to finish up with the labour supply side, and this is a little bit quicker, I've talked about pensions and health. There is more to life than money and health, of course. And those things can stop you or encourage you to work. First thing is leisure. It's great. We like it. That's why you have to pay us to work. Right? Leisure's a normal good. What does that mean in economics terms? A normal good means if people get richer, they want to do more of it. Okay? So cohorts are richer than they were. The rich are richer than the poor. It's only natural to expect those kind of groups to consume more leisure, and by which I mean to retire for longer. Okay? Current retirees are wealthier on average. I showed you the picture that said that pensions used to be more generous for the past retirees and are now getting less generous. So pensions are worth more. We know now, with the sort of cold light of experience of the past 10 years, that housing prices, went up at a rate that was historically unprecedented and probably won't carry on going up again, other than in London. Economic growth, productivity was higher over the last 1950 to 2000 than it certainly will be for the next 20 or 30 years, probably, short of us inventing something which is, we don't know about. So for all these reasons, the current cohort of retirees have been hugely wealthier than the people before them and the people after them. I say the people after them, again, we don't really know too much about that. But again, that is another pressure that's going to put people into work as they're going to want to, they're going to consume less leisure. One thing I would say on that is it doesn't really make sense to me as an economist to think about wealth for a particular generation. You have to think about wealth at the family level, the extended family. By which I mean grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren. Because essentially, if you think about the flows of money and time and everything that we all put into different generations, then if one of our parents' generation is particularly wealthy, that wealth gets spread across the family. And in fact, I know from when we talk to older sample members in ELSA, when I give talks, you say, oh, the current generation of pensioners is particularly wealthy. You say that to the current generation of pensions and you just get, a combination. At the best, you get some icy stares. At the worst, you get some terrible insults. Because, of course, the pressures for distributing that wealth to your children, the deposit on your children's house, the university fees for your grandchildren, the potential long-term care fees for your parents, those pressures are huge. So there's no sense in which the wealth belongs to that generation. It's spread across all the generations. So it's very, very hard to think about how all this plays out. So I think that when you do those kind of things, I think what we're going to find is actually more pressure or less wealth-related retirement in the future, potentially, than we have had in the past. But that's going to be the question. And caring responsibilities. I'm going to go quickly over them. But of course, the other responsibilities that you have with your time are going to be another factor on labour supply, and essentially they may well correlate with wealth. They may correlate with your ability to work and your health. So that's kind of, for me, that's the big question. I want to know, if I'm thinking forward, what is the wealth of these cohorts going to look like when you think about all the various transfers that have to be placed across up and down the generations in the context of all the caring that they do? For me, that's the big labour supply question. My hunch is that despite the fact that caring responsibilities are going to have the tendency to keep people out of the labour market, I suspect there's going to be more movement in. Okay, so that's it. So my conclusions. The past trends in work are consistent with increasing wealth of cohorts. I've just told you again, the current generation of retirees got a very good deal. And simultaneously, there was first an increase in the disincentives for them to work in the 70s and 80s, and sure enough, they didn't work. And then there was a reduction, and sure enough, they did work. So that suggests to me that looking forward, I think there's probably quite a lot of work at older ages on the horizon, even if we don't do anything. Just because natural economic pressures are going to kind of begin to take their toll. However, a lot of that, how long that's going to be, how quickly that transition is going to be, and quite where we end up is going to depend on these three questions, which I think we don't know the answer yet to. One is the productivity of older workers, and I mean that in the most general sense, how much can you match an older worker to an employer? What's the employer's willingness to pay for an older worker? And what's the worker's willingness to work for the wage that they're offered? How are the interactions between wealth and caring going to play out? And then potentially, how is this changing nature of work in terms of who's going to be able to exercise what kind of options for self-employment, for part-time work, all these things that are going to allow people to stay and work because they kind of want to or need to. So, you could interpret what I've been saying as a very sort of laissez-faire. Fine, it's all going to be good. Let's let the economy take care of itself. And we'll all be fine. But that's not what I'm saying at all. I mean, I don't mean to say that we should just sit back and say these factors should take their course. In fact, actually, pensions and disability benefit incentives are probably going to be particularly important for us to think about going forward. Why? Because it comes essentially to what you might think of as the inequality agenda. It's not just how much work have we got, but it's who's working. I've spoken most of today about how much, what are the average rates of work in the population. But we also need to look at the fact that these are very different across different types of people by health, by earnings capacity, and we need to look at essentially how families and everything sort of fits together with that. So if we're concerned about inequality in older population, then I think pensions and disability benefits we've got to do a lot to get the design of those things right. Essentially, if you go to the bottom point here, my question is, how can we set up pensions, disability benefits, so that actually what we need to do is we need to support people who can't work. So the 30% of people that I was telling you about whose health was not good enough to work, we need to be able to find a way of putting them on disability benefits that doesn't reproduce all the disincentives that we had in the 1970s and 80s that meant that everybody else left the labour market as well. And the same thing with pensions, okay? So in some sense, I think actually the imperative of policymakers to design pensions and disability benefits has actually probably got stronger, but not because we're interested in how many workers we've got, but because we really want to know exactly who's working and what are the inequality consequences of that. It is sort of super complicated, actually, as an economic problem to try and design a benefit which has an effect on the person that you're aiming for and doesn't have a side effect on the person that you're not aiming for. And I was working a little bit on it, and you start having to consider some really quite esoteric ways of people qualifying for the benefit. Their past history matters as well as their current state and whatnot. But I think for me that's the big question, really. I mean, it's a complicated problem because everything is sort of linked. Their health and their ability to take training is going to be correlated with their wealth, and it's going to be correlated with their family structures. So really it's very hard to sort of identify this kind of group. But I would argue that the sort of imperative is actually stronger than it has been in the past because of the inequality agenda. If you just want to know how much output are we going to get from older people, my answer is going to be more than we get now. And I think that, for me, is the optimistic solution, is the optimistic conclusion. But as I say, there are people who say, oh, we're all going to be forced to work till we drop. And I think that there are some people who take that as a sort of pessimistic solution. But I think the economic reality is that a 30-year retirement, retiring at 65 and living till 95, it just doesn't add up. So I think, to be honest, I think that's the end. I mean, I put this up here for those, if anyone is interested in the ELSA study, which underlies a lot of this. This is a website, and up there we have various different reports that have some of these numbers in. You can see various things about the study. You can see tables, and I'll leave that up there just for the Q&A, just so if people want to know more about some of the findings that we've been doing in this study.
Wonderful, Jim.
Do you want me to?
Okay, that was a wonderful, wonderful lecture.